I don't have a formal bio from our speaker, but she has a few things that she will say at the beginning to help you understand a little bit more who she is and what she does, which will be really interesting. But I'll just give you the briefest introduction here. This is Jana Scott, who is the coordinator of Prosperity 2020, which is an institute in the state of Utah trying to do some interesting things with education. So, Jana, the floor is yours.
Thanks. It's great to be here. First, if I can come to the party, I'll bring the naan.
You're invited.
You're invited. I did my graduate work in a part of England that's really Pakistani, so naan, curry was all I think, but not so much the Thai variety, more the Pakistani variety.
That's okay.
Anyway, great fun. So be there. So just to give you a little background, so I'm the coordinator with Prosperity 2020. Just out of interest, is anyone here, if you've heard of Prosperity 2020, raise your hand, just to get a sense. Okay. I'll have some things to say about what's happening in policy in education in the state. I would love to hear some of your thoughts too and get into some discussion at the end, but I'll just give you kind of a brief overview of things that are happening on this front. We consider it more of a movement than an institute, tapping into energy and social energy around the state, but with a lot of both communications focus and policy focus as well. So just to give you a little bit of background and just to get a sense of kind of where I'm coming from and the angle there. So I studied back in the day. Seems like just yesterday that I was here at BYU. And yet, as I was coming here, I started thinking, wow, time flies. It's amazing to me how quickly the years have flown. But as I was coming over here, I ran into some of my good old favorite study places, and some of the places in the hallway, remember, great places to sit when you were studying for your tests. Things like that. In fact, the pathway that I traveled as I was coming over here was a great reminder of my graduation day. I was over at the HVAC. I had a double major, and so I was over at the HVAC, and I decided I was just going to go to that graduation ceremony because I couldn't make both. So I'm sitting on stage in the graduation, and all of a sudden I see my father off on the side of the stage, and he's motioning to me like, come on. And so I'm looking around thinking, should I go, should I not, what do I do? And anyway, I took off, and he said, if we hurry, we can still make the other ceremony. So we were running across campus, this direction, to a building just right next door, made it just in time to kind of slip in line and walk up to the front and have fun with my friends there. So anyway, fun memories. Great to be here, and I think such great work happens here. I would love to be in your shoes, having the kind of time that you have to really delve into the issues. I'm more on the communications and policy side now, and I miss getting to just delve right into a lot of the issues. I have lots of questions that I would love to study. So I look forward to your thoughts as we get further into it. So I majored in international trade and diplomacy while I was here, as well as music, and then spent a lot of my work actually working in diplomacy with embassies and places like that, and finished with some graduate work in conflict resolution, which is kind of an interesting background for the work that I'm doing now. Studied in England, worked as a consultant to UNICEF headquarters, and ended up back in Utah, and have just, I landed here about the time that Prosperity 2020 was starting to come together. And I was just delighted to recognize all the kinds of dynamics that I had seen be effective in social change movements, in resolving conflict and bringing people together. It was all happening here in Utah. It was really thrilling to see that and to be pulled into it. So let me give you a brief introduction to Prosperity 2020, where it came from, what's going on, and then maybe we can get into some more interesting questions. So about the time I came here, there was a lot of conversation about a study at Georgetown about 66% of our population needing to have some kind of post-secondary degree or certificate of some sort in order to fill the kinds of jobs that we would need for our workforce. There was a lot of conversation about that. We were only at 43% at the time, and so 66 was a long way to go. And so there's a lot of conversation about, is this a goal we want to pursue? Is this something, is this real? Is this what we need to do? They talked with the Department of Workforce Services, which adjusted the numbers just a little bit according to their measurements and their perspectives. And then it progressively has become a statewide goal. This is just I'm just going to run through a few statistics that were concerning to business leaders and concerning to others at the time. So completion rates in college are falling, and in some groups that seems to be men have, I'm trying to make sure I say this right, how you get through all the different statistics. actually, let's just move forward. I feel like time is short, and I really want to get to the conversation. So, as you look at our test scores, if you compare Utah to peer states, it's a much more interesting comparison than just comparing us to the entire nation. So Utah Foundation did a study in which they compared Utah's test scores to peer states, states that had a similar demographic, similar rates of education amongst adults and parents, and some similar socioeconomic situations. And amongst that group of peers, Utah ranked last. You'll note that these are from a few years ago. The more current statistics and numbers are very similar. So that's both in reading as well as math. That's caused some concern. You've probably noticed that the minority share of the population is increasing in Utah. We see it in Salt Lake City even more, I think, than other parts of the state. So blue is Utah, red, Salt Lake County, green, the U.S. And you can see how over the decades there, that percentage of our population has grown, and it's anticipated that it will continue to do so. These numbers are from the other university up by us in Salt Lake City.
You still must be wrong.
Friends there? I've been to both, and it's really interesting to see. I would tell you more stories about that, but since I'm on video, I'm going to save those for later. Some good after conversations. When you look at CRT, measurements of performance on reading and math tests, CRT is the state, or you're probably familiar with it here, more than other groups would be. So the original scores we're looking at were from NAEP, national ones, and based on just samples. This is from the test that all the students take at the end of the year. And look how the different groups perform on that test. Here's with mathematics. You can see that some of those groups that are growing in Utah are also ones that are struggling in terms of their performance. So, and this is just one of interest, Utah's education funding effort now ranks lower than it has in the past as well. So, with the concern about these falling test scores, about the changing dynamic and needing to respond to the needs of students in the state so that more students could be successful, Prosperity 2020 launched this movement for education. You may have seen some of these kinds of posters that drew attention to the fact that our younger generation right now is our future workforce, and that really key to economic development is education. It's changed the conversations that I've heard on Capitol Hill and in a lot of places in Salt Lake City. Here's another. We had some from various professions. These are all pictures of CEOs of Utah companies. This one you might recognize. So as the movement began, the group of people that were starting it, a group of Utah business leaders, particularly associated with the Salt Lake Chamber, looked at past efforts to help education in Utah. And they looked at what had worked, what hadn't worked, why things had lasted or not lasted. And from that drew some conclusions. Oh, I'm skipping. You know what, that slide is a couple down. We'll get there in a minute. At this point, a few years later, there's now some statewide goals that have been adopted by the State Board of Education, the State Board of Regents, the Board of Trustees from UCAT, State PTA, State UEA, a whole variety of groups that are involved in education. That 66% of Utahns will have some kind of post-secondary certificate or degree by 2020. Currently, well, as of 2010, it was 43%. A goal that 90% of elementary students are proficient. You probably saw that those scores were ranging in kind of 60s, 70s, low 80s. And if you looked at the average for Utah, it was 82%. Or not the average, but kind of the total there. And then a third goal, which is mostly a Prosperity 2020 goal, but has been adopted by some others, is that Utah will also be a top 10 state for STEM jobs, careers, things of that sort. Do you have any questions right off on this? Okay. A little bit about Prosperity 2020. It was started by business leaders in Salt Lake that were concerned. This is Mark Bouchard. He was the original chairman. He had moved here from Las Vegas and was very interested to see what he saw in Utah and had a lot of comparison having lived in other states prior to. He is very articulate, has been a wonderful spokesperson for education, and has been just amazing at bringing people together. One of the dynamics that existed in 2009, 2010, when things were starting, was, you know, with the challenges that education was facing, there was a lot of finger pointing. Because, you know, it's not my fault, so it's got to be someone else's, and people, I was surprised to see how difficult it was for people to work together, just because of some of the blame games and things of that sort. And then there's always the whole thing of teachers, I think, feel like legislators make their lives difficult, and legislators sometimes don't have great things to say about teachers. That's totally a generalization, but I feel it in lots of different environments that I've been in. And I think it's unfortunate because you just can't accomplish as much together when you're not able to at least work together and problem solve. About that same time, the Governor's Commission was starting, and the governor brought together all the key parties in education to talk about some of the challenges and how we could make a difference, how we could improve the test scores, how we could, I guess more importantly, how we could create real learning and get students that were progressing and achieving and being successful. And so from that, he started pulling together, you know, the state superintendent, the commissioner of higher education, UEA, PTA, and just a variety of other groups, superintendents, and business people, a variety of others. And I think it's been one of the few commissions I've seen where everyone attends every meeting. So often people start to lose interest as time goes on, but over the last 3 years, consistently, at their monthly or bi-monthly meetings, almost everyone is there. So some great things happening there in terms of collaboration as well. But when they first started, there were people who wouldn't sit by each other. You know, you come in and your name tag is sitting next to someone that you don't want to sit by, and people just didn't want to sit there, and so it was kind of a challenge, as I understand. But within a year or two, there's just great open discussion and disagreements across the table, but the ability to work together even when there is disagreement. So it's been fun to see that happen. This is our current chair. Mark Bouchard is now the chair of the Governor's Commission. Alan Hall, anyone familiar with the name Alan Hall? He's a venture capitalist from Ogden, Utah, and a great business leader in Utah. He is the current chair of Prosperity 2020 and just picked up in the last 3 months or so. So we're in a new stage of transitioning some of his leadership. So the Founders Council of Prosperity 2020 consists of chambers across the state. That list is growing as other chambers join us. And then you'll see that there's also a group of other business organizations that have interest. The World Trade Center Utah, Utah Foundation, United Way of Salt Lake, the Governor's Office of Economic Development, GOED, has been a great supporter, and the Economic Development Corporation of Utah. They're a group that recruits a lot of business to Utah. And anyway, so a great group that is involved in founding the whole thing. Business support comes from a lot of our business leaders, a lot of executives in Salt Lake of major companies. Again, this group is growing and changing this year. A lot of STEM and technology, science, math type companies are coming on the board currently. The focus of our work has been, first of all, to help build the spirit of collaboration, to help people, again, start working together to problem solve and to get past some of the challenges that happen when we all separate. If I can just offer kind of a quick side note there, things have maybe not been as extreme in Utah, but if you think about a classic conflict dynamic, it starts with some major disagreement or difference of perspective or something. And so you then get people who consider themselves to be on opposite sides, and you start to talk about the other side in negative ways. You don't interact with the other side as much because it's usually a lot more of talking about them than actually interacting with them. If you do interact, it's in the media, or testifying in a committee meeting, or in some kind of formal setting where it's not always really great for discussion and connecting. And so things just escalate, and sometimes you even start calling the other side names and all those kinds of things that start happening until the other side becomes kind of this big monster in your mind. And so often when people actually then connect with the other side or the other, it's amazing at how people start to connect and realize the common interests, and then find positive ways to work together. Just one kind of fun story that happened early on as we were starting this. The Salt Lake Chamber's Board of Governors was having kind of their annual retreat. And it just happened to be at the same location that the UEA, the teachers union, was holding their retreat. And so as they were out at lunch, our business leaders were kind of walking around them to go over to our lunch. And we had built a nice connection with them already, but initially there was, you know, some apprehension, I think, probably on both sides. But as we were headed to lunch, our CEO stopped and said he wanted to share a little something with these teachers, and so they allowed him to do so, and the business leaders kind of all got in they were in like a big U, and all the teachers were sitting in their chairs eating lunch, and Lane proceeded to give a speech about how important teachers were and how much he appreciated what they gave and what they did. Talked about his mother being a teacher and the experiences that he had grown up with in their home. And then at the end he said, "We just have one thing we want to say to you." And then after a moment of silence, all the business leaders just started clapping. It's kind of a standing ovation. And they started clapping. And the teachers were visibly touched. And they stood up and they started clapping. And it was just this moment that kind of connected people. Maybe a little kumbaya-ish. But things like that do make a difference when you start to connect, or you see each other in a different way, or you feel appreciated by someone that you didn't formerly feel appreciated by. There were other conversations that happened in a lot of one-on-one conversations where the trust really had to be built initially. You can't do much together until you have some kind of bond of trust, and then you have the ability to do great things together. So a lot of the first year was really focused on building those relationships of trust. And when people have felt like their trust has been broken by others, it kind of takes a little longer too to really establish that you're committed and that you really care and that you care about their good and you know, the interest of learning, that you're not there for some other cause. But the business leaders who started it were some of the most genuine people that I've met and that came across in the way they interacted with people, which I think is why I was invited to come back today, because Andy had been in a presentation made by Mark Bouchard, the original chair. And as just a quick side note, it's been fun for me to watch how individuals with their leadership styles can do a lot to bring people together. Just the way they talk, the way they treat people, changes the tone, it changes the dynamic in things. One of the really interesting dynamics at the end of the first, I think it was the first legislative session that we were involved in, was that both the Commissioner of Higher Education and also the State Superintendent said that the conversation around education on the Hill had changed, that the tone about education had changed, because it was seen more as this really important piece of economic development. It was an important piece of our state growing. And are there any questions up to this point? I don't want to.
I don't know if you've ever even looked at this. I see a lot of connection with 2020 and code.org. I don't know if you're familiar with coding or code.org. It's kind of the, Peter, you're familiar with code, aren't you? It's pretty much the same idea, but coding, not STEM. We need to teach kids how to code.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Anyway, I just wondered if you had seen any, if you know that.
No, I'd love to be aware of that connection.
Yeah, it's business leaders, it's the Facebooks, it's the Twitters, it's these major
National,
companies.
global?
National.
Definitely. It's actually Code.org week this week. It's
Oh, is it?
Hour of Code week. They're
This
trying
is
to
it?
encourage people to code for an hour where they learn to make something, show
So,
people that it's possible.
Over 8 million people have learned an hour of code. That's what it's on their homepage. I was just curious if you'd seen any connection.
No, it's great to know, and it would be a great connection, particularly with the technology,
Mhm.
and all that.
Yes, it's just
effort.
code.org.
Code.org, great, thanks, I'll look it up.
What do these business leaders see as kind of like short-term? I guess maybe I'm a little cynical of them being really altruistic about it, but like, I guess what's in it for them in the short term, like as opposed to like hopefully by 2020, you know, they have these employees that are prepared. So I guess where do they see the benefit?
That's a good question. I understand the cynicism, and on a broader scale, I would feel the same.
Yeah.
The tight group that I work with, I've been really touched with how much they give. And the motivations, I think some of them just have a real passion for learning and growth, like probably you do, like I do. It's the main reason I do what I do, why I work for a nonprofit. I seem to always be drawn that direction. but it's deeply rewarding at the same time. What else to tell you? One of the things that they have interest in is you know, with the lower socioeconomic groups in Utah that are having challenges in education, I think they'd like to see some growth there, because it's also a real benefit to the state, because as those people become more independent and are able to carry on their own, they have better lives for their families, better all of that, and it also creates more, I mean, this is just really a long-term thing, but it creates more ability for us to use state funds for productive, for learning and things, instead of taking care of all the problems that happen when young people don't get that opportunity. I guess I'm a little bit of a loss to answer, because I really think it's genuine. There may be those who are drawn in for other reasons, but.
I mean, I guess I see these business owners are kind of like expecting like quarterly returns in their business lives, and so are they pushing you towards kind of like similar goals and things like that?
This is one of the most fun things. We are all learning from each other, so they go in with expectations and things like this, and then they come away from conversations with teachers and principals and others saying, wow, I didn't realize what you're working with. And I think vice versa, it allows both sides to bring the best of their experience to work together. I think we've realized over time that a lot of the business principles that we thought would just be so applicable and save the day, need some, that there are other dynamics in education that are different and that have to be addressed. And so I've actually seen them grow in respect for educators, and I've seen educators be really grateful for the perspectives that business brings as well. I should just add that one of the reasons I was originally drawn to Prosperity 2020 was that in their kind of original statement of intent, their statement of values, they said, we don't pretend to have all the answers. Something needs to be done, but we trust the educators and those who are professional in that field to know what it is. That was a huge draw to me. In other places in this country, it's business leaders, I think, coming in saying, here, let us save the day. And I haven't felt like it's that way here. I think there's a genuine respect. I mean, occasionally, sure, they start having ideas. We start having ideas that we think are helpful, but at the end of the day, I think there's tremendous respect for educators. In fact, our public education consultant teaches here at your school. Does anyone know Gary Carlston at all? He teaches some of the future teachers here, as I understand that. So, and he, I think he was touched to see the business leader's approach, because it was not what he expected. In fact, most times when we go into a room initially, walls are up and hands are up, and people think that they're going to have to be defensive because they're so used to having to be defensive, and it often ends up with either tears or tears of gratitude or a connection or something. And maybe that's part of where my whole background in conflict resolution peace studies comes in, because it's a different approach than is usually taken, and it's more about connecting people and problem solving and getting through some of the challenges, rather than being always in our positions of advocacy, where we're always fighting each other or defending our perspective or our need. So anyway, I think some good things are happening here. Another interesting dynamic that's occurred in the last year, the legislature decided that they wanted to delve more into the issues of education. So they created a task force, and it was chaired by both the President of the Senate as well as the Speaker of the House. And they have spent the year meeting monthly, discussing different issues, primarily focused initially on achievement and what facilitates achievement, what facilitates learning. And it's been fun to watch them really listen. They've had moments where they've been surprised too. One day they had teachers come in and testify, and another day they had, and I might just add, some of the teachers were just thrilled to be there, because they felt like they don't usually get the chance to do that. They're not always listened to. Another day, principals came in from schools that they were Title I schools, but that had been very successful and had students really excelling. And at the end of their presentation, it was just really fun to see. Legislators were energized. They were so excited, feeling like something really could be done to help these students learn. And so there have been moments of discovery along the way, and I think the whole process of being open during the last year has been helpful. It will be interesting to see how that translates into this next session. The group that has met is trying to pass on kind of key principles that they think should govern legislation for for education, because you probably know, way too many bills are passed every year, and it just makes it difficult to ever keep up, or, yeah, you're always adjusting to the latest last thing that was passed. So they're trying to help focus that, and to focus it on these elements of achievement that they've heard identified by the State Office of Education, by Utah Foundation, by researchers, by a core group of people that have testified. So watch, we'll see, it'll be interesting to see what happens. There still is a skepticism on some people's part because, you know, history. And so it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But good things are happening. I think people are deeply engaged in education, and they're looking at it in new ways. And I hope that through all of that, this whole focus of appreciating the expertise that education brings to education becomes a really core part of that. I think it is, in all the discussions I've heard, it generally has been, which I think is refreshing. Other questions on that? Yeah.
So I'm looking at the Prosperity website as well, and I've looked at the issues and visions and goals. So in terms of actual action items, what sorts of things do you see this group proposing that be done to prepare people for this 2020 STEM goal?
Can I come back to that
Yep.
in a few minutes? It's a great question. Let me just run through a few quick things just so you're aware of these dynamics. Prosperity 2020, we decided that to be successful, it had to be long-term. This again came from looking at past efforts that had kind of come and gone. Has to be long-term because that's the only way you create that sustained effort. And in so many organizations, people keep changing, and then agendas keep changing as a result. And so we felt like there needed to be this kind of constant, consistent effort at change. And I would say not reform. Sometimes people talk about reform. We don't generally talk in those terms. It needed to be statewide. It needed to involve the entire state and not just be a Salt Lake City or one part of the state effort. Hence the involvement of all those chamber presidents, and then listening tours and meetings in different parts of the state. Communications focus. Even if you change policy or help improve things on that front, at the end of the day, you still have masses of people, and there needs to be, I think, a real important communications component to that to ultimately be successful. So that's part of what we do. I think you'll see more of that in the next year. The first few years have been really focused on building the trust, getting people together, and helping to establish some of those statewide goals that we're all working toward. See what else? Collective impact. Our core principle is collective impact. You may have seen a study out of Stanford that talks a lot about what people can do when they come together and problem solve. That's kind of the core idea. I won't focus in on that right now because I really would prefer to hear from you. I think Prosperity 2020 has been pretty effective at creating more trust. There's always more to be built. There's always more work to be done. But amongst the decision makers in general, I think there's some good feeling. Not all legislators love it yet, so, but I think we've also changed the way that we work with them this year, and hopefully that will produce some positive results. Established awareness of the importance of education to economic development and to quality of life, to all of those things. Increased statewide commitment to education. Last year, the president of the Senate said, if you've done anything, you've at least made it really politically popular to talk about education. Maybe that's worth something. And then have helped generate these statewide goals that has brought everyone on the same page. One of the events that came out of last year's legislative session is a STEM pilot that is trying different one of the focuses is math and helping more students be proficient in math, changing mindsets about math. And so the STEM Action Center was created to help do that. They're based at the Governor's Office of Economic Development, and they, this last year, have started a pilot with a variety of technologies to help kind of students in that middle school, early high school range really start to excel in that. The P2020 Business Promise is contributions on the parts of employers and business people to help in education. It's just one example. Questar has given 60 volunteers for a school year, and they go into a classroom once or twice a week, I'm not sure how many times, but they go into a classroom once or twice a week and spend an hour with a child that's struggling reading. And they've just had phenomenal success at helping these students get up to grade level by the time they finish that year. And just having that one-on-one time seems to have been really helpful. Others give big donations for a variety of projects and things, but statewide we're encouraging more businesses to get involved in some way. You might have heard one of the local stories. There's apparently a great 7-Eleven owner who wanted to help kids read, so we got a bunch of books at 7-Eleven, and during the summer, kids could check a book out, and then if they'd bring the book back and tell them what it was all about, he would give them a free Slurpee or something like that. But they had to tell them about the book. They couldn't just bring it back. They had to have read it. The Utah Valley Chamber has been challenging 80% of businesses. Their goal is that 80% of businesses in the area will do something to contribute to education, and hopefully in ways that are helpful to education and not just for the sake of giving. We're trying to help facilitate some of that as well. So it's a statewide movement that's still growing. As you can see, it's kind of focused right now on a lot of decision makers, but I think in the next year will become much more of the people, or much more widespread. And I think there's some, it's been really energizing to see the things that are happening. And I've even felt amongst the people that I work with that there's been more hope that really something can be done, that things can be made better. Any other questions on that front, or can I ask you a few questions and come back to yours? Yeah.
Well, just a question about the goals. Do you have a goal of 66%? First question, how is that obtained? How did it come to that number? And the second is, how do you define post-secondary education?
So how is it achieved?
Well, how did you determine
The
that
number?
it should be 66%?
So it came from that study from Georgetown, from the Center on Education and the Workforce, I think it's called. Carnevale was the researcher's name. And then the numbers were then adjusted by Department of Workforce Services.
So they determined that 66% of the workforce should be college educated?
Yeah, yeah, and I said, someone else would probably be better to address that in detail. But they looked at the kinds of industries, the kinds of needs that they anticipated having. And granted, it is a projection, so it is. In terms of how to get there, the the Utah system of higher education has worked with all the different university presidents of public universities to come up with a plan of how they can help more of their students finish. We have we have a pretty high rate of some college but no completion, how they can help graduate more students. And so that's been a big discussion, and of course with that comes the question of resources and funding, and how on earth do you do that? They're working on that now. UCAT has a plan for how they'll expand their programs. Theirs are more connected to business. Utah, are you familiar with UCAT? It's the technology and trades and things like that. And so they are really connected to business anyway. And business often will come and request, we need more positions of this sort or this type, more technicians, more this. And then they'll expand their programs in the area to produce what the companies are saying they need. So there's a little bit more responsiveness there, and they have a plan for expansion,
So you're
very
including-
detailed plan.
You're including the technical trades as post-secondary?
In the 66, it was included in the original study, and it's continued to be part of the discussion. As you can imagine, there are lots of discussions about the value of bachelor's degree and liberal arts education, and all of these things. These are all parts of the discussion. And what else was I going to tell you? There's some talk about how we could help those who are partway through but just haven't finished yet. I mean, getting to 66 is a huge endeavor, and we haven't been particularly specific about how it's to be done. We've let those who educate do that, but we help facilitate and act as catalysts where it's helpful. And sometimes just having the business voice express the need has been helpful in moving the needle and helping things happen. So that's largely in the hands of education, but then of course we're doing a lot of work with the legislature to try to help pave the way for more of that to happen, for it to be higher priority. Other questions? We have probably just 7 minutes, is that right? can you just tell me a little quickly, I would love to have heard more initially about your background. I understand you're all in the area of instructional design, is that right? Something along that line, more or less? Anything else? Anyone else in this room that's from a different background?
Sorry, token.
I'm instructional design, but I'm planning on being a filmmaker and just writing professionally right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow, neat opportunities there too. What are some of the, in terms of learning and growth and how you help facilitate learning, what are some of the gems you've discovered in your time? I would love to hear like the TED Talk style version of kind of the top 2 or 3 things, or just insights that others ought to be aware of when it comes to good learning and conditions for learning.
Well, I found number one, I taught elementary school for 3 years, and if you don't know your students, if you don't know who you're really working with, I mean, something like this is great, but if you're not down and dirty in the ditches, it's never going to work. And that's what I learned from my students. I could get new students, and if I didn't take the time to get to know them, I couldn't teach them.
Yeah, that's an important part. And one that may not always be measured by some of the forms of measurement. Other thoughts, other insights? Yeah.
I do an after-school program with kids in elementary school. I'm doing Lego Mindstorm, trying to teach them robotics and programming. And I would have to say that giving them an opportunity to really just use what they learn and play with the robots and kind of experiment has been the best way to get them to learn, as opposed to just telling them everything. So.
And then math makes more sense, it's more interesting because you've got to understand those principles or science.
And that's our goal, is to try and help them with other subjects through this after-school program, hopefully by learning robotics and programming, the thought processes that go along with that. We're hoping to maybe help them better recognize what a function is in mathematics and possibly other fields we haven't even thought of yet.
That's great. There's a lot of interesting things like that, and businesses are becoming more interested too in investing and helping things like that happen, some of the applied learning. Other insights you're willing to share? Or maybe I should just wait and read your book someday, huh? It's an interesting discussion. This is a big debate that is held in lots of places, and you have insights that a lot of people would love to have. Maybe there'll be opportunities in the future to make some of those connections. Very interesting.